Connie Martinson Talks Books. If you like short stories, but I mean short, but have really the O. Henry ending, my guest today, E. King, has been able to capture that in a book called Real Conversations with Imaginary Friends. Welcome, Evie.
Thank you.
And the publisher for this book is?
27th Dimension Press, a small press out of Baltimore.
Interesting how all of these different places have new publishing companies.
Isn't it, though?
Yeah. Now, this was not your first career writing for this type of book.
Not at all. No, I've had a lot of reincarnations myself.
Yeah.
I was a dancer, and I did acting and comedy, and then mostly I've been an artist and biologist.
Yeah. Oh, that's a whole other sort of
switch on
bottom of the line, right. But this book has a little of everything.
Yes.
Beginning with, as I said, the short story Cold Fusion, which is about the fact, tell our friends about Cold Fusion in Sydney.
Well, Cold Fusion is actually based on a man I know who is a brilliant chemist, physicist. Yeah. And sadly enough began losing his mind through the dementia. And I was just thinking, what if underneath, because he liked to stay in his office and read, and what if there were things, we don't know what's going on sometimes behind the mind.
Yeah.
So in my book, with a child's chemistry set, he comes up with cold fusion, but of course no one takes him seriously.
Yeah.
As I think often happens.
And it was sad. Here he was a Nobel laureate, and he becomes ill, and the university, well, they were glad to give him an office up to a point.
Up to a point.
And then they probably gave him a dinner and said, don't be afraid to come over every once in a while, but don't make this home.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Such a sad sort of ending, and it happens to many people.
It's true, it's true. As I said, this was actually based on a real story.
Yeah. Now, the next one is the hearing aid. Tell our friends a little bit about Charles and the woman he's living with.
Charles is a very effetist music critic. You know, only the best for Charles. Yeah. PhD in Debussy, and his girlfriend is or lady companion perhaps. She's a harpist at weddings and very much subservient to him. And he insists she gets hearing aids, which seem to distort things. And every time she puts them in, she hears odd things. Sometimes it's Mexican music, and then she hears what she thinks is a radio show that Charles is doing, but it turns rather intimate. And as is revealed, the hearing aids actually hear things that are going on when she doesn't have them in. Yeah. And when she puts them in her ears, they tell her what's been happening in her absence. Which she doesn't want to know.
That's sort of science fiction out of wishful thinking. There's another story, too, that is similar, and The Group.
The Group.
Yeah.
Well, as I say, I do have a background in art as well, but The Group is about that time in Paris when it was all about the group, Impressionists, you know, Expressionists. It wasn't so much one painter as a group would do shows. So this group is rather unsuccessful until they start doing portraits of this beautiful young man, Remy. And Remy makes them popular, but Remy is tired of posing and he isn't really getting paid, but he's starving, so they keep getting him to pose, and eventually the last series of paintings they do are of a gaunt young man bound to a chair, and a skeleton in a chair.
Much of your work is almost, I thought, like haiku, because you're able to do it in a page and a half.
Yeah, I really like that. I've written longer, and a lot of times, in fact, I have in my new collection that's not out yet, I have stories about people saying, you need to expand, you need to write longer, and I often don't want to. So in one of the stories, the woman actually blows up the story and explodes on her and suffocates her.
What triggers you to sit down and do a story?
It's interesting. I think usually it's I mean, sometimes I wake up with stories just in my head, complete. Or sometimes I just sit down, I might have a line or an image, and the story tells itself to me.
Yeah.
It's really rare, maybe when I'm working on a longer work, where I'm really sitting trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. But there are a couple of longer stories in this book that I think of as short stories, but they are at least 4 pages, and there's a lot on them for those 4 pages. Eddie Evers' Electric Detective Agency. What was that story?
Well, that story, and I've actually written a part 2 to him. I think he's a character that's going to come back and back and back, because I rather like him. He's kind of a Bogart type. Yeah. And he gets struck by electricity, not just once, but twice. And the first time he kind of starts liking electricity, and the second time he realizes he can speak electric. He can actually talk to current.
Yeah.
And he says there's good current and bad current. It's like the same current that blows up a city isn't the same current that would light up a school.
Yeah.
And it's like Hitler and Gandhi. They're both meat, but it's very different results. So he's an electric detective. And when there are certain cases, they come to him, because electricity, it can destroy without any help, bombs and whatnot.
There's credit to you in the front of the book from Ray Bradbury. And your stories are very different from his, and yet there's a sort of a theme that brings you back to, gee, that reminds me of Ray's work.
Oh, great. Thank you. I've been very influenced, and Ray's been a big mentor of mine. I visit him. Sometimes I read him work, and he'll say, good idea. And, you know, no, just keep knocking them out there, because sometimes people say, oh, you need to make them longer, you need to rewrite more, and he says, no, just put it out there. So I said, well, Ray Bradbury told me. It's very...
I can do what he says.
I can do what he says. I have the...
All right, tell me about the story, Reincarnation, because she is, well, one has an angel.
Mm-hmm. An angel appears, and I mean,
it has a rather bloody ending.
It has a rather bloody ending. A lot of my stuff, most of my stuff doesn't seem to end very well, even when I try.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is. Reincarnation, an angel appears to her, and I think about our thoughts of angels classically. They're all sort of white and colorless, and not all the wonderful things of the world are incorporated in them. So this angel kind of drains her of all of that, and eventually takes her life. Yeah. And leaves her bloody on the bed and takes over her life.
The reclamation of George Peter Spencer, but it's GPS.
It's GPS. Oh, good. I'm so glad you got that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and the fact that any of us who has a GPS, depending upon the voice you picked, is like somebody in the family now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm glad you got that it was George.
Yeah.
Peter
now,
Spencer.
I'm going to ask you if you will read How Novels Come.
I would love to
grow.
read that. How Novels Grow, yes. Let me just find it in my book.
That is on page, as I put my glasses on, page 107.
107.
And you'll hear how Evie writes as E.E. King.
How Novels Grow. Samantha Green was walking by the library one early spring afternoon when a short story ran from the building, grabbing her by the leg. Shoo, shoo, she cried, trying to shake it off. But in reply, the story merely growled. It clung to her with sharp, pointed metaphors, piercing her tweed trousers, her socks, and possibly her heart. Go, she said. Go back where you belong. But the story held her fast, with a plethora of adverbs, lurid description, purple prose, and superfluous adjectives. Samantha was a plain, mousy spinster who always wore her gray-brown hair pulled tight in a severe bun, shoulders hunched beneath threadbare sweater. Her eyes were dwarfed behind large rectangular horned rims. But now, battered by bromides, her hair unwound, curling golden locks cascaded down her now lithe, straight back. Her glasses melted, and luminous, double-lashed, gazed islets, 2 crystal violets at the leaf-green afternoon. Birds twittered around, occasionally taking the stray end of a strand of golden hair that fell across her face in their beaks and flying it off her valentine, fragile countenance. "Don't! Stop!" she protested, weakly in dulcet tones. The story gave another firm shake, and Samantha's once-bitten nails grew long, pale pink with ivory moons. With a final toss, similes and analogies flying like sweat, it opened a wide, gaping tunnel of hyperbole and swallowed her whole. Giving a satisfied brr, it strolled off in search of a hero.
I love it. Bravo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, on page 115, The Ghost in the Tower, which is another family story, or Why I Am Not an Heiress.
On the peacock-infested grounds of my father's boyhood home stood a tower that loomed large in my childhood imagination. It was disconnected from the main mansion and could only be entered by a separate door. One night, sweet Ezra decided to slumber there. My father decided to ensure that his little brother's visit was a memorable one. Climbing into the tower, he hammered a nail onto the upper window ledge. From this, he hung a string, another nail fastened to it. To this bottom nail, he hammered a broomstick over which he draped a sheet. This way, when night winds blew, tiny, sweet Ezra would hear a tap, tap, tapping at his bower window and turn to see a ghostly apparition of white, apparently trying to get in for a chat. According to my father, it worked perfectly, and Ezra ran screaming out into the night, presumably not his first choice of destination. I have always wondered what prevented the nail from tapping at the window before nightfall, or why, nail or no nail, Ezra, sweet but stupid perhaps, did not notice a ghost when he first made up his bed. But, alas, these niceties of details are lost in history. Meanwhile, my nasty grandfather was amassing a fortune. He was devoted to his money and feared that upon his demise, his worthless offspring would speedily dissipate his hard-earned dollars. To prevent this disaster, he included in his will the clause that none of his children could sell any of his property until the youngest, sweet Ezra, turned 50. Mistake! Although everyone has heard that real estate is a wise investment, and although my nasty grandfather purchased large tracts of Long Island, family hearsay has it practically owning it, by the time his youngest was 50, it had turned into a slum. Buildings were burned out, and the only inhabitants were drug addicts and trees of heaven, neither of which paid rent.
You know, the fact you could turn this into such a charming story. It's everybody with a family. There's a story, you know, we could have bought Wilshire Boulevard. We could have bought Fifth Avenue. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And this is true. This is a true story.
What about the story about your grandmother?